Welcome to Explain Movie, where films are never just entertainment. Every frame holds a clue. Every scene means more than it seems. And every story is hiding something waiting to be found. From big-budget blockbusters and mind-bending sci-fi to spine-chilling horror, dark thrillers, and cinematic gems time has forgotten, we dig past the surface to uncover hidden details, wild fan theories, clever Easter eggs, behind-the-scenes secrets, and untold stories most viewers never catch. Because the biggest mysteries in film aren't always sitting in plain sight. This isn't just about watching movies. It's about discovering what's underneath them. Subscribe to Explain Movie, and experience cinema in a whole new way. Out for Justice, the film that defined Steven Seagal's golden era. The film did remarkable business at the box office and cemented Steven Seagal's rise as a genuine star. His portrayal of Mason Stormer, another hard-nosed lawman clawing his way back after surviving an assassination attempt, only deepened the sense that Seagal was becoming something close to unstoppable on screen. Audiences loved the mix of martial arts, procedural grit, and revenge-fueled storytelling. That same stretch also brought Marked for Death, another hit that broadened Seagal's appeal by folding Caribbean culture and supernatural undertones into the action formula. With 3 commercial successes back-to-back, Seagal entered the 1990s as one of Hollywood's most bankable new names. Out for Justice became his 4th starring vehicle, and arguably his most personal film to date. Detective Gino Felino stands apart from Seagal's earlier characters because he's tethered so tightly to his own neighborhood and the people in it. Rather than chasing terrorist cells or shadowy conspiracies, Gino is driven by something much rawer: the murder of his childhood friend, Bobby Lupo. That personal stake lets Seagal show more visible anger and emotional weight than he had in previous roles. He still carries his trademark cool under pressure, but there are moments where real grief and fury slip through the calm. Seagal also produced the film, which gave him real say over its direction, shaping the fight choreography, the pacing, and the overall tone. Much of the hand-to-hand combat leans on techniques borrowed from Aikido, favoring joint locks, throws, and quick disarms over drawn-out slugfests. That style became one of the signatures of his early career, setting him apart from the gunpowder-heavy spectacle common in other action films of the time. Playing the film's antagonist is William Forsythe, whose turn as Richie Madano is still remembered as one of the most striking parts of Out for Justice. Before this role, Forsythe had already earned a reputation as one of Hollywood's most reliable character actors. He never chased leading man status. Instead, he built a career playing volatile, unpredictable men who could turn dangerous in an instant. His weathered look, expressive face, and knack for swinging between charm and menace made him a natural fit for criminal roles. By the time Out for Justice came along, Forsythe already had an impressive RA copyright of supporting work in film and television, including Once Upon a Time in America, Raising Arizona, and Dick Tracy. Directors consistently praised his ability to make characters feel genuinely unhinged rather than cartoonishly evil. As Richie Madano, many critics and fans consider this the finest performance of his early career. Richie isn't a calculating villain with a master plan. He's impulsive, reckless, and frightening precisely because nothing about him is predictable. He guns down Bobby Lupo in broad daylight without a second thought, then spends the rest of the film unraveling further into violence. Forsythe steers clear of the typical action movie villain playbook, instead playing Richie as someone whose sheer instability makes every scene feel like it could explode. Part of what makes the character so memorable is Forsythe's total commitment: the thick Brooklyn accent, the manic laughter, the sudden flashes of rage, the physical presence that fills a room. Even in his quieter moments, you sense violence simmering just beneath the surface. That constant unpredictability keeps the tension alive and raises the stakes of every scene between Richie and Gino. Fans still rank Richie Madano among the best villains to ever appear in a Seagal film, not because he's a physical match for the hero, but because his chaos and utter disregard for consequences make him a genuinely dangerous opponent. Without Forsythe's performance, this could easily have been a far more forgettable revenge story, a film born into a crowded genre when Out for Justice hit theaters in 1991. It landed in one of the most competitive stretches in action movie history, an era when a star's persona mattered almost as much as the film itself. Arnold Schwarzenegger stood for raw physical dominance. Sylvester Stallone embodied grit and perseverance. Bruce Willis brought sarcasm and vulnerability. Jean-Claude Van Damme delivered gymnastic martial arts. Seagal offered something else entirely, and Out for Justice helped sharpen that identity, setting him apart from his rivals as the calm, seemingly unshakable dispenser of justice. The film never reached the cultural heights of Terminator 2, Die Hard, or Lethal Weapon, but its reputation grew slowly through home video, cable reruns, and repeat viewings. Over time, it became one of those movies fans revisited again and again, introducing new generations to its gritty atmosphere and unforgettable characters. Today, it's regarded as one of the defining urban revenge thrillers of the early 90s and one of Seagal's most respected performances among longtime fans. One of the film's biggest strengths is its depiction of Brooklyn. Rather than glossy skylines and tourist landmarks, Out for Justice zeroes in on neighborhood life via corner stores, family ties, and the unwritten rules that hold tight-knit communities together. It feels authentic because everyone in it seems to actually know each other. Cops grew up alongside criminals, families go back generations, and personal history is inseparable from professional duty. This mirrored a broader fascination in the late 80s and early 90s with stories about organized crime and Italian-American neighborhoods. Goodfellas, released just a year earlier, had already shown audiences were hungry for grounded stories built on loyalty and betrayal. Out for Justice isn't trying to be a gangster epic, but it clearly borrows from that tradition, portraying a world where crime and everyday life exist side by side. The film also tapped into the anxieties of its moment. Public concern over violent crime, drug trafficking, gang activity, and urban decay was running high, and the news was full of murders, corruption scandals, and organized crime busts. In that climate, audiences found real satisfaction in watching a fictional cop who acted with total moral clarity and certainty. Gino Felino offered a fantasy of swift justice at a time when the real justice system felt sluggish and ineffective to many people. Unlike morally conflicted TV detectives, Gino's mission is never murky. His lifelong friend was murdered, and the man responsible has to be stopped before anyone else dies. That simplicity is exactly what escapist audiences wanted. The film never asks viewers to see Richie's side or question whether Gino's crusade is justified. It draws a clean line between good and evil, letting the audience fully invest in the hero's relentless pursuit. The film also left a mark for how unflinchingly it portrayed violence. Where a lot of 80s action movies leaned into big explosions and huge body counts without dwelling on the emotional cost, Out for Justice takes a different approach. Richie's murder of Bobby happens in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, with brutal cruelty instantly marking him as irredeemable and giving the story real emotional stakes. Every act of violence throughout the film feels personal rather than random, because the victims are neighbors, relatives, and old friends rather than anonymous extras. That approach gives the action genuine weight and separates the film from many of its more spectacle-driven contemporaries. Forsythe's Richie Madano has also earned a lasting place in pop culture as one of action cinema's more memorable villains. He has no elaborate schemes and no extraordinary physical gifts. His menace comes purely from his volatility. Unlike a calculating mastermind, Richie is a ticking time bomb. And that unpredictability struck a chord with audiences because it offered a different flavor of villain, someone dangerous not because he controls an empire, but because he has no self-control at all. That template went on to shape how later crime films wrote unstable antagonists who trade on psychological menace rather than grand plans. The film also cemented Seagal's fighting style in the public imagination. Before he arrived in Hollywood, mainstream martial arts stars leaned heavily on kicks and acrobatics. Bruce Lee brought speed and precision, Chuck Norris brought karate, Van Damme brought flexibility and flashy spin kicks. Seagal introduced audiences to Aikido-based combat built around balance, leverage, and efficient joint manipulation. Behind the camera, every memorable action film has a production story worth telling, and Out for Justice is no exception. Released in 1991, it might look like a straightforward revenge thriller on the surface, but making it involved experienced filmmakers, demanding choreography, extensive location shooting, and a leading man with growing creative control over his own projects. By that point, Seagal had already become one of Warner Brothers' most profitable stars, and each success gave him more say in how his films were made. Out for Justice reflects that shift, a part studio picture, part personal project shaped heavily by its star. Director John Flynn built his career on realistic crime dramas rather than glossy blockbusters, earning respect through the 70s and 80s for grounded characters and tense, believable storytelling. His earlier film Rolling Thunder, a revenge thriller starring William Devane and Tommy Lee Jones, showcased his skill at blending action with real emotional weight to making him a natural fit for this project. Rather than lean on flashy camera work, Flynn favored a restrained style that let performances and atmosphere carry scenes, which suited Out for Justice perfectly. The tension here comes less from explosions and more from the dangerous personalities driving the story. Flynn was determined to make his Brooklyn feel lived in rather than romanticized. He wanted audiences to see the everyday neighborhoods where friendships, family loyalty, and criminal influence coexist. So much of the shoot took place on actual Brooklyn streets rather than studio sets. The decision paid off. Viewers see real residential blocks, dive bars, storefronts, and intersections instead of polished Hollywood constructions, and the production leaned into the imperfections of aging buildings, crowded sidewalks, narrow streets, weathered brick. Those details make it easy to believe Gino Felino genuinely belongs to this world. Of course, filming on real New York streets brought real headaches, closing roads, managing traffic and crowds, and coordinating stunts in active neighborhoods took careful planning, especially once word got out that Seagal was in the area and locals started showing up to watch. Seagal came into the production at the peak of his early popularity. After the success of Above the Law, Hard to Kill, and Marked for Death, Warner Brothers saw him as one of its fastest rising stars, and his track record gave him real influence over decisions, especially around choreography and how his character was portrayed. Unlike actors who simply execute whatever a stunt coordinator designs, Seagal was hands-on in planning his own fight scenes, drawing on decades of Aikido training to make sure every confrontation reflected the martial arts philosophy rather than a standard Hollywood brawl. His emphasis on balance, leverage, and efficient movement became a defining trait of the film's action. Stunt performers who worked with him later noted that his choreography demanded a different kind of preparation than typical fights, and as rapid wrist locks, arm breaks, throws, and disarms that relied on precise timing rather than long strings of punches and kicks. Because of that, extensive rehearsal was essential for both realism and safety. Every throw had to be practiced repeatedly so performers knew exactly how to land. Padding stayed hidden under clothing wherever possible, and camera angles were chosen to sell impact without adding real risk. Flynn deliberately avoided the rapid cut editing many action films relied on at the time, instead letting fight scenes play out in wider shots that actually showed Seagal's movements. That choice set out for justice apart from its competitors and gave audiences a real chance to appreciate the technique on display. Casting William Forsythe as Richie Madonna turned out to be one of the production's smartest moves. While Seagal naturally drew most of the attention, Flynn understood the story needed a villain who could match its emotional stakes. Rather than someone bigger or more physically intimidating than Seagal, he chose an actor who could bring genuine psychological unpredictability to the role. The story Out for Justice tells a deceptively simple story, but underneath its straightforward revenge plot is a tightly built crime thriller rooted in personal history and escalating tension. Instead of sprawling conspiracies or globe-hopping stakes, the film stays anchored to a few blocks of Brooklyn, where every character shares years of history. That intimacy pulls the audience into both the action and its emotional fallout. The story unfolds as part police investigation, part deeply personal mission, blending crime drama with martial arts action at a relentless pace from start to finish. It opens by immediately grounding us in setting and tone, a Brooklyn where families have known each other for generations, and where cops, residents, business owners, and criminals all share the same streets, their personal and professional lives constantly overlapping. That setup matters because it explains why what happens next hits Gino Felino so hard. And unlike action heroes handed a random case, he's dealing with people he's known his whole life, so every confrontation carries the weight of shared history. The inciting incident lands almost immediately, and it's one of the film's most jarring scenes. Bobby Lupo, a fellow officer and Gino's lifelong friend, is gunned down in broad daylight by Richie Madonna. It's not the result of a calculated plan, it's an impulsive act by a man who has completely lost control of his violent impulses. Richie shoots Bobby repeatedly in front of horrified witnesses, instantly establishing himself as a threat to everyone around him, not just to the police. Narratively, this opening does a lot of heavy lifting at once. It creates instant emotional stakes by killing a sympathetic character before the story has even settled in. It defines Richie's personality with almost no exposition needed, and it hands Gino a crystal clear mission. From here on, the film is a relentless pursuit fueled by friendship, loyalty, and a sense of duty. After Bobby's death, the story shifts into investigation mode, though it's not a whodunit in the traditional sense, since everyone already knows Richie is guilty. The real question is where he's gone, and whether Gino can find him before more people die. That framing turns the movie from mystery into pure suspense. Gino combs the neighborhood, questioning old acquaintances and following every lead, and because he grew up there, the investigation feels organic rather than procedural. He knows which bars the criminals drink in, which relatives might talk, which rumors are worth chasing. These scenes build out the world naturally while reinforcing just how rooted Gino is in his community. The script smartly alternates between Gino's search and glimpses of Richie spiraling further into paranoia and violence, letting the audience track both the hunter and the hunted at once rather than losing sight of the villain after the opening murder. One of the film's real strengths is its pacing. Rather than jumping from one action beat to the next, it balances quieter and conversations in bars, apartments, and local business with sudden bursts of violence, letting tension build before it's released. Along the way, we learn more about the shared history between Gino and Richie. They grew up in the same neighborhood, knew the same people, followed the same unwritten rules. That shared background adds real complexity to their conflict. Richie isn't some outside threat invading Gino's world. He's someone who grew up right alongside him and chose a different path. Part of the story's tragedy comes from watching him tear apart the very community that shaped him. As the film progresses, Richie's violence spreads to more and more people, friends, relatives, criminal associates, because he's incapable of protecting anyone, even those closest to him. It reinforces a central idea: unchecked violence eventually consumes everything around it. Meanwhile, Gino's pursuit becomes less about duty and more about grief, loyalty, and anger. though the script is careful never to frame him as chasing selfish revenge. Instead, his mission reads as an attempt to restore order to a community that Richie has shattered. Throughout, Gino solves problems through observation, street knowledge, and personal relationships rather than forensic tech or elaborate surveillance. A grounded style of policing that predates digital databases and cell phones, and one that feels authentic because it depends almost entirely on human interaction. Themes: justice, loyalty, and community. On the surface, Out for Justice looks like a simple story about a cop hunting down his best friend's killer, and its explosive fights and relentless pace can easily overshadow what's happening underneath. But there's a genuinely rich exploration here of loyalty, justice, family, violence, and the fragile line between order and chaos. Director John Flynn never spells these ideas out through speech, so they emerge through character, action, and setting, letting the film stay true to its identity as a gritty crime thriller while still saying something meaningful. The clearest theme is the meaning of justice itself. The title makes that explicit. This isn't purely a revenge story. Gino wants Richie to pay for killing Bobby, sure, but his motivation goes beyond personal anger. He's acting as a grieving friend and as a cop trying to restore peace to a neighborhood torn apart by senseless violence. The distinction between justice and revenge grows more important as the film goes on. Revenge is driven by emotion and seeks satisfaction through suffering. Justice tries to restore balance after a wrong has been done. Gino lets his emotions surface at times, especially when he thinks about Bobby or sees the damage Richie leaves behind, but he never abandons his principles even in the most dangerous confrontations. He's focused on stopping further harm rather than settling a personal score. Richie represents the opposite, a man with no real moral boundaries, acting purely on impulse and treating human life as disposable. Through that contrast, the film examines what happens to a community when justice disappears and chaos fills the vacuum. Loyalty runs through nearly every relationship in the film. Gino's drive comes directly from his bond with Bobby, a friendship stretching back to childhood, which makes Bobby's murder feel like the loss of a lifelong connection rather than just a colleague. That kind of deep-rooted relationship mirrors the close-knit Brooklyn the film depicts, where families have known each other for generations and created obligations that go beyond anything legal. Gino isn't chasing Richie because it's his job, he's doing it because loyalty demands it. The film also shows how loyalty can curdle the people around Richie stick close out of fear rather than respect, and as his behavior spirals, those fragile bonds start collapsing. Friends pull away, associates lose faith, even family members can no longer defend him. It's a clear message: real loyalty is built on trust and shared values, while loyalty built on fear eventually falls apart. Community and belonging matter just as much. Unlike action films built around a lone hero, Out for Justice keeps reminding us that its characters exist within a larger social fabric. Brooklyn practically functions as a character in its own right. Every street and storefront carries emotional weight because generations of people have lived their lives there. Bobby's murder doesn't just hit Gino, it ripples through the whole neighborhood, as families mourn together and everyone senses something has fundamentally shifted. Violence here never stays contained, it spreads through families and friendships, leaving scars well beyond its immediate victims. That framing raises the emotional stakes. Gino isn't defending some abstract notion of justice here, he's protecting the place he calls home. Family shows up in multiple forms throughout the story. Blood relatives matter, but chosen family carries just as much weight. Bobby is family to Gino in every way that counts, despite there being no biological tie. Richie's relationship with his own relatives offers a pointed contrast. Rather than protecting them, his recklessness drags his wife and family into the chaos he creates, and their fear illustrates how violence within a household destroys trust and safety. The film ultimately suggests that family is defined less by genetics than by responsibility. People who look out for others strengthen the community around them, while those driven purely by selfish impulse end up destroying themselves and everyone nearby. Violence itself is treated as a serious subject rather than pure spectacle. Every act of brutality here has consequences. Bobby's murder sets off grief, fear, and more bloodshed, and Richie's total inability to rein himself in creates a cycle that eventually swallows nearly everyone connected to him. Visual style and cinematography. Part of what sets Out for Justice apart from other action films of its era is its visual identity. The movie is best remembered for its brutal fights and standout performances, but its cinematography plays just as important a role in building atmosphere. Flynn deliberately steered away from the glossy, heightened look many action films were starting to adopt in the early 90s. Instead, he and cinematographer Rick Waite built a world that feels grounded and unmistakably real. Every frame reinforces the sense that this is happening in an actual Brooklyn neighborhood whose ordinary lives have just been upended by extraordinary violence. Waite was already a seasoned cinematographer by this point, having shot films like National Lampoon's Vacation and Red Dawn, and he knew how to make real locations feel cinematic without losing their authenticity. Rather than glamorize the city, he shot it almost like a documentary, letting its natural texture through aging buildings, crowded sidewalks, working-class gritter become part of the storytelling. From the opening scenes, the film's urban character is unmistakable. There are no glossy skylines or postcard shots of New York, or just neighborhood streets, apartment blocks, corner stores, local bars, churches, and family businesses. That approach gives Brooklyn a strong sense of presence. It's not just a backdrop, it's an active part of the story, carrying the emotional history of the men who grew up there and now find themselves on opposite sides of a war. The color palette reinforces that realism. Instead of the saturated, stylized look common in a lot of action films, Out for Justice leans on muted earth tones and natural lighting. Browns, grays, dark greens, faded brick red, weathered concrete, leather jackets, denim, and police uniforms all blend naturally into that restrained look, keeping the focus on character rather than flashy production design. This isn't a story about glamorous heroes saving the world. It's about ordinary people confronting violence close to home. The lighting follows the same philosophy, often relying on natural or naturalistic setups. Daytime scenes use soft, filtered sunlight, while nighttime sequences lean on streetlights, neon, and practical interior sources rather than flooding scenes with artificial brightness, letting shadows dominate large portions of the frame. That creates a persistent sense of uncertainty. Dark alleys and dim bars suggest danger could emerge at any moment, while still preserving the grounded tone, avoiding the exaggerated color grading common in a lot of modern action films. There's also narrative logic behind the light and dark contrast. Bobby's murder happens in broad daylight, making the violence feel even more shocking because it invades an ordinary afternoon, while later confrontations increasingly happen in darker settings, mirroring the moral darkness spreading through the neighborhood as Richie unravels. Camera placement is another strength. Flynn consistently favors compositions that establish spatial geography, medium and wide shots that show viewers exactly where people are before cutting closer, which pays off during action sequences by keeping every movement legible and believable. Unlike a lot of contemporaries, the camera often stays steady during dialogue scenes, relying on simple shot-reverse shot setups that let performances carry the moment rather than distracting visual tricks. A clear sign of Flynn's confidence in his cast. The fight scenes showcase some of the film's best camera work. Seagal's Aikido-based technique looks nothing like the flashier martial arts styles popularized by other action stars, emphasizing balance and efficiency over acrobatics. So Flynn and Waite intentionally minimized cutting to let his complete movements register on screen. Wrist locks, throws, and disarms stay visible from start to finish instead of being chopped up across dozens of quick edits. That honesty gives the action real credibility and separates the film from productions that rely on editing tricks to fake skill. Camera angles during these scenes generally stay at eye level too, putting the audience right in the middle of the action instead of exaggerating it with extreme perspectives. Sound and Music Out for Justice is best known for its brutal action and gritty tone, but one of its more underrated strengths is how deliberately it uses sound and music, instead of the loud orchestral or rock-driven scores common in action films of the era. It takes a far more restrained approach. Flynn understood the film's grounded tone would benefit from subtlety rather than constant musical cues, so the score and sound design work together to build tension and mood without overwhelming the performances. The score comes from David Michael Frank, a composer with a strong track record in film and television, known for writing music that supports a story rather than dominating it. Rather than a heroic theme constantly announcing Gino's strength, Frank composed music that reflects the story's uncertainty and emotional weight. It rarely calls attention to itself, instead quietly reinforcing the atmosphere so audiences stay immersed rather than distracted by the score. That understated philosophy fits Flynn's directing style perfectly. From the opening moments, the score sets a somber tone, avoiding triumphant fanfare in favor of darker harmonies that hint something tragic is coming, priming the audience for a story about loss rather than celebration. After Bobby's murder, the music becomes one of the film's most effective emotional tools. So rather than manipulating viewers with sentimentality, Frank uses quiet orchestral passages that convey grief and determination, letting Gino's pain register mostly through Seagal's performance while the score gently underlines it. For long stretches during the investigation, music disappears entirely, a choice that reflects real confidence from both director and composer, since silence often builds more tension than constant scoring, especially in a crime drama. Letting conversations, footsteps, and neighborhood ambience dominate certain scenes keeps things feeling authentic and unpredictable. When the score does return, it usually serves a specific purpose, using subtle rhythmic patterns to build suspense during Gino's search without pulling focus from the dialogue. Rather than telegraphing exactly when danger will strike, it maintains a low simmer of unease that keeps the audience alert. Frank also leans on restrained orchestration, low strings, muted brass, synth textures, occasional percussion rather than big symphonic arrangements, which suits the intimate scope of a story confined to one neighborhood rather than global stakes. Unlike a lot of action films from the period, Out for Justice rarely uses fast-paced musical cues to energize its fight scenes. Several major confrontations rely almost entirely on natural sound instead, which significantly boosts their realism. During hand-to-hand combat, viewers hear bodies hitting walls, punches landing, furniture breaking, and feet on concrete. Those raw sounds become the soundtrack of the fight itself, making every movement feel more immediate. That approach suits Seagal's fighting style especially well. His Aikido techniques are about precision rather than spectacle, and letting the audience hear each impact clearly, every wrist lock producing an audible snap, every throw landing with real weight, sells the effectiveness of the moves without needing exaggerated visual effects. The sound team put real care into making these impacts believable. Fists land with heavy, solid thuds, wood splinters convincingly, glass shatters with real sharpness, and gunfire carries the weight of real firearms rather than cartoonish bangs. That realism is especially important during Bobby's murder. The sound of each gunshot echoing through the neighborhood is what makes the scene land with such sudden, terrifying force. Critical and commercial reception. Out for Justice arrived in 1991 during an intensely competitive stretch for action cinema, filled with major stars and audiences who expected ever bigger explosions and villains each year. With 3 consecutive hits already behind him: Above the Law, Hard to Kill, and marked the death. The expectations for Seagal's fourth starring role were high. The film didn't become the year's top-grossing action movie, but it performed solidly, further cemented Seagal's standing as one of Hollywood's leading action stars, and eventually built a lasting reputation through home video and cable reruns. Reception was notably split between audiences and critics, a pattern that would follow Seagal through much of his early career. Fans came in expecting straightforward action, memorable fights, and a charismatic hero rather than dense drama, and the film delivered exactly that, satisfying viewers drawn to Seagal's distinctive fighting style and unshakable screen presence. Financially, it performed well relative to its modest budget, confirming Seagal's place as one of Warner Bros.' most dependable stars of the early 90s. 4 hits in a row proved audiences would keep showing up for his particular brand of action even as the genre grew more crowded. By this point, moviegoers knew exactly what to expect from a Seagal film: a disciplined hero, efficient martial arts, gritty settings, and relentless pursuit of justice, and that consistency became one of his greatest assets. Critics, on the other hand, were more divided. Many acknowledged the film succeeded at what it set out to do but questioned how original it really was. A revenge plot built around a murdered partner or friend were already common in action cinema by then, and some reviewers felt the script leaned too heavily on familiar genre beats. The unstoppable detective, the unhinged criminal, the loyal neighborhood, the inevitable showdown. Still, even lukewarm reviews consistently praised specific elements. William Forsythe's performance as Richie Madano was almost universally singled out as one of the film's biggest assets, with critics repeatedly noting how his volatility elevated what could have been a routine villain. Several even suggested he nearly stole the movie from its star, his explosive energy contrasting sharply with Seagal's restraint to create one of the film's most compelling dynamics. Seagal himself drew more mixed notices. Supporters praised his physical presence, martial arts skill, and understated confidence, appreciating that he projected authority without over-the-top emotion, a trait that set him apart from louder action heroes. Others criticized his limited emotional range, arguing his restrained expressions kept audiences from connecting more deeply with Genoa, a critique that followed him throughout his early career. Even skeptics of his acting, though, generally credited the effectiveness of his physical performances. Unlike stars who relied heavily on editing or stunt doubles, his genuine Aikido background gave the fight scenes real credibility. The action itself drew consistent praise. Critics highlighted the grounded, efficient nature of the fights. Every movement seemed built to end a confrontation quickly rather than show off, which set the film apart at a time when many competitors were leaning into bigger explosions and more exaggerated stunts. Flynn's more intimate approach, prioritizing physical skill over visual excess, stood out. Reviewers also praised the Brooklyn setting's authenticity, noting that the extensive location shooting gave the film a realism many studio-bound productions lacked, portraying a believable working-class neighborhood with its own history rather than an anonymous urban backdrop. Flynn's direction earned its share of praise too. Critics recognized his ability to keep the story moving while letting performances lead, even if some wished for more visual ambition. Legacy. More than 3 decades on, Out for Justice holds a distinct place in action film history. It was never meant to spawn sequels or become a blockbuster franchise. It succeeded instead through strong performances, practical filmmaking, and a grounded approach to storytelling, and that combination has kept building it a loyal following long after its theatrical run. Its biggest legacy might be helping establish Seagal as more than a passing trend. Above the Law introduced him. Hard to Kill confirmed his popularity, but Out for Justice proved audiences kept coming back for his particular combination of martial arts, police drama, and understated presence. A real achievement in a genre dominated by giants like Schwarzenegger, Stallone, Willis, and Van Damme, each with a completely different brand of stardom. Seagal carved out his own lane, calm, disciplined, never relying on jokes or exaggerated feats of strength, winning fights through precision rather than spectacle. Out for Justice sharpened that identity more clearly than almost any other film in his early career, and many fans still consider Gino Felino one of his finest characters. Unlike some of his later, near-invincible roles, Gino stays emotionally connected to the people around him, driven by friendship and grief rather than abstract heroics. The film is also frequently cited as a cornerstone of what fans call Seagal's golden period, alongside Above the Law, Hard to Kill, Marked for Death, and Under Siege films defined by practical action, believable combat, memorable villains, and relatively restrained performances. Many longtime fans consider this stretch the high point of his career, before bigger budgets and shifting creative choices changed the tone of his later work. As a result, Out for Justice remains a frequent recommendation for anyone discovering Seagal's filmography for the first time. Forsyth's Richie Madano left his own mark on the genre. While plenty of action villains are remembered for elaborate schemes or overwhelming force, Richie endures because of his psychological unpredictability. His influence shows up in later crime thrillers that favor unstable, emotionally volatile antagonists over calculating masterminds. He's terrifying because he can't control himself, and because neither the audience nor the other characters can ever predict what he'll do next. Decades later, action fans still cite Forsyth's performance as one of the biggest reasons the film holds up, with many arguing his chaotic energy perfectly complements Seagal's calm to create one of the strongest hero-villain pairings of the early 90s. The film also helped shift how martial arts were presented in mainstream American action cinema. Before Seagal, audiences mostly associated the genre with spectacular kicks and acrobatic combinations. His Aikido-based style, rooted in leverage, balance, and efficient movement, offered something different, and Out for Justice contains some of the clearest examples of that philosophy. Gino frequently ends fights within seconds through precise throws and wrist locks rather than drawn-out exchanges. Few later action stars adopted Aikido as their signature style, but the film broadened public awareness of martial arts beyond karate, kung fu, and taekwondo, proving that effective combat could look controlled and technical rather than purely athletic. Its commitment to practical filmmaking has also aged well. In an era increasingly dominated by CGI, Out for Justice relies almost entirely on real stunts, physical performances, and location shooting. Every fight uses real stunt performers, every explosion happens practically, and effects like broken furniture and shattered glass were created on set rather than generated digitally. That tactile realism has only grown more appealing as conversations about practical versus digital effects have intensified over the past 2 decades, with younger viewers often remarking on how tangible the action feels compared to more effects-heavy modern films. How audiences have responded over time. One of the more interesting aspects of Out for Justice is how differently generations of viewers have read it. Released in 1991 as a straightforward action thriller, it's been revisited again and again as both cinema and society have shifted, gradually earning appreciation as a snapshot of a specific moment in filmmaking and urban American life, even as attitudes toward violence, policing, and heroism have evolved around it. Despite those shifting interpretations, one thing hasn't changed: audiences keep finding the film entertaining because of its authenticity, memorable characters, and grounded action. For viewers who caught it in theaters back in 1991, it delivered exactly what action fans wanted at the time: practical stunts, physical combat, a charismatic hero, and a villain who felt like a genuine threat, all well before superhero movies and CGI took over the genre. Many connected instantly with Gino because he wasn't some distant superhero. He lived in the same neighborhood he policed, knew both the victims and the criminals personally, and was driven by something as relatable as friendship rather than abstract political stakes. Bobby's murder became the emotional anchor for a lot of viewers. The sudden, senseless tragedy set the stakes immediately and gave the audience someone to grieve alongside Gino without needing dramatic speeches to sell it. The neighborhood itself resonated too, particularly with viewers from big cities who recognized the same close-knit community dynamics, whether they grew up in Brooklyn or somewhere else entirely. That familiarity gave the story real credibility rather than depicting anonymous city life. It showed a world where everyone knew each other's names and histories, something many viewers found oddly comforting even as violence threatened to tear it apart. Forsythe's performance also struck a chord. While audiences naturally rooted for Gino, plenty left the theater talking mostly about Richie, who felt frightening precisely because he was so believably capable of erupting into violence for almost no reason at all, which created constant, uncomfortable suspense. Even decades later, he's still cited as one of the most memorable villains of the era because his behavior feels psychologically real rather than exaggerated for effect. Seagal himself drew a range of reactions depending on what viewers expected going in. Fans loved his calm confidence and efficient fighting style, appreciating how focused he stayed under enormous pressure. Others, more accustomed to Bruce Willis's humor or Stallone's emotional intensity, found his restraint a bit too reserved. Even so, most of those critics still acknowledged how effective his physical performances were. Audience interpretation kept evolving over the years, largely thanks to home video. In the 90s, plenty of fans discovered the film through VHS rentals rather than theaters, and repeat viewing at home let them catch details they'd missed the first time. The authenticity of the Brooklyn setting, the strength of Forsythe's performance, Flynn's restrained direction. Conversations shifted from being purely about the fights to also covering atmosphere, dialogue, and character. Cable TV extended the film's reach even further, turning it into a regular feature on action-oriented channels throughout the 90s and early 2000s. Introducing it to a new generation who often approached it less as a contemporary action film and more as a classic representing an earlier filmmaking style, one where practical effects, real locations, and a slower pace read as strengths rather than limitations. Character arcs. What makes Out for Justice resonate more than 3 decades later is that its characters feel like real people rather than action movie archetypes. Though it's remembered mostly for its fights, its emotional core comes from the relationships and personal journeys of its characters. Flynn clearly understood that action only lands when the audience actually cares about the people involved. So every major character serves the film's larger themes of loyalty, justice, and the destructive nature of unchecked violence, whether or not they undergo dramatic change themselves. At the center is Gino Felino, and unlike a lot of action heroes who start out isolated with few real attachments, Gino is deeply embedded in his community from the very first scene. He's not just a cop assigned to a new case, he's a lifelong resident who grew up alongside the people he now protects. That grounding sets him apart from more typical protagonists. His identity comes from relationships rather than professional accomplishments, and everyone from fellow officers to local shop owners knows him personally. Because of that foundation, Bobby's murder hits him not just as an investigator but as someone who's lost a piece of his own past. From the start, Gino already has a strong moral compass. He's disciplined, confident, and respected. Unlike heroes who need to learn courage over the course of the story, his arc isn't about becoming someone new, it's about testing the values he already holds under extraordinary pressure. Bobby's death is the defining emotional event of the arc. More than a colleague, Bobby represents childhood memories and irreplaceable friendship, and as the investigation wears on, Gino faces grieving families and frightened witnesses who all remind him of what's been lost. Despite that mounting pressure, he never lets anger override his judgment, and that discipline becomes central to his character. Seagal's performance stays intentionally understated, but attentive viewers will catch small shifts in expression, tone, and posture that communicate grief and determination without a single dramatic speech. By the final confrontation, Gino has been tested repeatedly, both physically and emotionally, having watched Richie's destruction ripple through the community, yet he never abandons his sense of responsibility. His victory ultimately means more than just beating a criminal. It confirms that discipline and loyalty can outlast hatred and revenge. Unlike heroes who grow more violent as their story unfolds, Gino ends the film essentially unchanged. As a persona, it's the world around him that's different. That kind of flat arc, where a steady protagonist reshapes his circumstances rather than being reshaped himself, defines his journey throughout. Richie Madano moves in the opposite direction entirely. Where Gino represents emotional discipline, Richie embodies total psychological collapse. Interestingly, he doesn't start the film balanced and slowly unravel a we never see before. His opening murder of Bobby immediately establishes that he's already crossed the line with no way back, and from there his instability only deepens as the story goes on. Costume and production design. One of the more overlooked strengths of Out for Justice is the care put into its costumes and production design. Unlike genre films that lean on extravagant visuals, this one succeeds by making everything feel completely ordinary. Every jacket, apartment, and street corner contributes to the illusion that we're watching real life unfold in Brooklyn rather than actors performing on constructed sets. Flynn clearly understood that authenticity would be one of the film's biggest assets, and the costume, set, and location teams delivered a world that feels believable from start to finish. The story unfolds almost entirely in working-class Brooklyn, and the visual design reflects that reality immediately, and nothing looks glamorous or polished. Buildings show real wear, sidewalks look worn from decades of foot traffic, and businesses look like they've served the same families for generations. Rather than idealize New York, the filmmakers embrace its imperfections, and those small details establish atmosphere before a single line of dialogue is spoken. Much of it was shot on real streets instead of studio sets, giving the film a level of authenticity that's hard to fake. Yet brick apartment buildings, narrow residential blocks, family-run stores, neighborhood bars, churches, and small restaurants all combine into a convincing picture of early 90s Brooklyn life. Every location feels genuinely tied to the people who inhabit it. Apartments are filled with personal belongings suggesting years of family history. Restaurants carry the kind of decor regular customers would expect, and bars feel warm and worn-in rather than staged, with furniture and knickknacks that look accumulated over decades rather than dressed for the camera. These environmental details tell you about class, background, and personal history without needing a word of dialogue. Gino's wardrobe reflects his character perfectly. Rather than a stylized costume meant to make him look larger than life, he dresses like an actual street detective via leather jacket, jeans, casual shirts, practical boots. That leather jacket became one of Seagal's visual trademarks during this era, but here it never feels like a superhero costume. It's functional and reflects his working-class roots more than any sense of fashion. The wardrobe communicates confidence without vanity and professionalism without formality, reinforcing the sense that Gino truly belongs on these streets. He barely changes outfits throughout the investigation, reinforcing the relentless, uninterrupted nature of his search. The loose fit of his jackets and shirts also gives him room to move freely during his Aikido sequences, serving both the story and the stunt work at once. Richie's wardrobe stands in sharp contrast. It's a touch more flamboyant than Gino's while still feeling grounded in the neighborhood, projecting confidence and authority even as it hints at his growing disorder. As the story progresses, his look subtly grows less controlled and more disheveled, mirroring his unraveling mental state. Where Gino's style is calm and practical, Richie's clothes feel louder and more aggressive, reinforcing their opposing personalities without a word needing to be said. The supporting cast's wardrobes are just as carefully considered. Police wear period-appropriate uniforms without unnecessary flourish. Detectives look slightly less formal but still professional, and the criminals dress according to their status rather than leaning on exaggerated gangster cliché. Copyright S. Background characters are shopkeepers, bartenders, family members, pedestrians are all dressed naturally for their environment, nothing theatrical or overly coordinated, which strengthens the documentary-like feel of the whole film. The wardrobe also captures early 90s fashion without drawing attention to itself. Denim jackets, leather coats, patterned shirts, and practical outerwear that have aged more gracefully than a film built around flashier trends might have. Set decoration matches that same attention to detail. Every interior feels lived in rather than staged, with family homes full of photographs, religious items, and personal collections built up over years. The screenplay Out for Justice is often remembered for Seagal's martial arts, but the script written by David Lee Henry deserves real credit too. At a time when action movies were getting bigger and more over the top, Henry deliberately kept things simple, skipping elaborate conspiracies and endless exposition in favor of believable conversations between people who've known each other their whole lives. The screenplay understands its real strength isn't plot complexity but the authenticity of its characters, relationships, and setting. Every conversation either deepens our understanding of Brooklyn, raises the emotional stakes, or builds tension toward the final confrontation between Gino and Richie. The writing is efficient to almost nothing exists just to fill time. Nearly every exchange advances the plot, develops a relationship, or builds atmosphere and tension. That economy keeps the pace steady while avoiding unnecessary subplots. Unlike many modern action films that over-explain every plot beat, Out for Justice trusts its audience. Characters rarely narrate things the viewer can already see, letting performance and visual storytelling carry the weight. That restraint gives the dialogue a natural rhythm, closer to how people actually talk than to speeches written for an audience's benefit. One of the script's real achievements is how naturally it conveys shared history. Gino, Bobby, Richie, and the supporting characters have all known each other since childhood, and the script never needs to remind us of that directly. It comes through in the way people casually reference old memories, family ties, and neighborhood traditions. That gives the film the sense of dropping into lives that have been unfolding for decades, relationships that existed long before the story started and will keep going long after it ends. Gino's dialogue mirrors his personality, direct, calm, and purposeful. He asks questions, gives instructions, and occasionally issues a warning, but he never wastes words. A style that complements Seagal's understated acting perfectly. Rather than long emotional speeches, Gino communicates through action and subtle shifts in tone, reflecting someone who thinks before he speaks. Notably, he never needs to announce his own toughness, or his reputation already precedes him within the neighborhood, so his quiet confidence carries more weight than any loud threat could. Richie's dialogue is the exact opposite, impulsive and unstable, swinging unpredictably between humor, anger, friendliness, and violence within the same conversation. That unpredictability is one of the script's most effective tools for building suspense. The audience never knows how he'll react, and even ordinary conversations can turn threatening in an instant. His lines often shift mid-sentence, mirroring his fractured state of mind, and Forsyth's delivery makes even mundane words sound unsettling. His dialogue also reveals that he simply can't think past his own immediate emotions, or his words tend to mirror whatever he's feeling in the moment rather than any long-term plan, which only reinforces how genuinely dangerous he is. One of the script's more impressive qualities is its ear for authentic neighborhood language. Characters speak with natural Brooklyn rhythms suited to their environment, and conversations feel lived in rather than polished for the screen. The writers avoid making everyone sound the same. Mere cops, criminals, family members, and shopkeepers each have distinct speech patterns reflecting their backgrounds. Those subtle differences strengthen the film's realism, and the script even conveys the community's closeness through overlapping dialogue, inside jokes, and references to people who never actually appear on screen are small touches that suggest a social world much bigger than what's on screen. Humor plays a modest but real role too. Though the film is fundamentally serious, it includes moments of dry wit that offer brief relief from the tension, usually arising organically from character interaction rather than traditional jokes. Gino occasionally delivers a dry, understated line reflecting quiet confidence rather than comedy for its own sake, letting humor emerge naturally from the situation rather than breaking the film's tone. Marketing: the film When Out for Justice came out in 1991. Movie marketing looked nothing like it does today. No social media, no viral trailers, no constant digital back and forth with audiences. Studios relied on theatrical trailers, TV spots, radio ads, newspaper coverage, magazine interviews, billboards, and the rapidly expanding home video market. Warner Brothers understood exactly how valuable Seagal had become, and the campaign leaned almost entirely into his growing reputation rather than trying to sell a complicated plot. Steven Seagal was back, and another intense action film was on the way. By this point, Seagal already had Above the Law, Hard to Kill, and Marked for Death behind him, all commercial successes that had built a recognizable brand among action fans. His name alone had become a selling point, and Warner Brothers built the campaign around it. Trailers and TV spots highlighted his calm confidence, brutal fighting style, and relentless determination rather than explaining every plot detail. Banking on the fact that fans already knew what to expect from a Seagal film, the title itself did a lot of work, immediately signaling determination and a moral purpose without giving away specifics, or fitting neatly alongside other punchy action titles of the era like Above the Law, Hard to Kill, Total Recall, and Under Siege. The theatrical poster was another strong asset. Seagal front and center, serious expression, confident posture, weapon in hand, all reinforcing the image audiences already recognized from his earlier films. The design was simple and effective. No explosions or crowded visuals, just Seagal as the focal pointer with a dark, muted color palette that accurately signaled a gritty urban thriller rather than a lighter action comedy, and bold, no-frills typography that communicated seriousness and intensity. The trailer followed the same philosophy, using carefully selected action beats and dialogue to build excitement without giving away the whole plot. Bobby's murder established the emotional stakes quickly, while brief glimpses of Richie's volatility hinted at the danger ahead, and editors balanced story with action. Fights, gunfire, and confrontations appeared often enough to hook action fans without spoiling the climax, in keeping with early 90s trailer conventions that generally avoided major spoilers. The trailer's music emphasized urgency through dramatic orchestral cues and tight editing, trusting the visuals and performances rather than leaning on a popular song or heavy narration, the way a lot of modern trailers do. TV advertising made up another major piece of the campaign, with 30-second spots running heavily during sports broadcasts and prime time. Given the limited runtime, these ads focused almost entirely on Seagal, Forsyth's menacing villain, and the explosive action, particularly the wrist locks, throws, and disarms that made Seagal's fighting style so distinct from what Schwarzenegger or Stallone offered, a key part of his brand that Warner Brothers highlighted whenever possible. Print media played its part too, with magazines and newspapers regularly running interviews where Seagal discussed his martial arts background and rising fame, reinforcing that his fight scenes reflected genuine skill rather than choreography learned for the camera. Flynn also did press, discussing his approach to grounded crime dramas and his collaboration with Seagal. While directors usually get less spotlight than stars, his reputation for authentic filmmaking helped reassure audiences the film would prioritize realism over pure spectacle. How it stacks up against similar films. Out for Justice sits at an interesting crossroads within the action genre, part classic revenge thriller, part grounded police drama built on community and personal responsibility. Unlike a lot of its late 80s and early 90s peers, It skips the global conspiracies and military-scale stakes, staying rooted in a single neighborhood and letting its characters carry the emotional weight. Comparing it to Seagal's other early films and to the wider action landscape of the time helps explain why it's remained one of the most respected entries in his catalog. The most natural comparison is to Seagal's own filmography. Above the Law, 1988, introduced audiences to his screen persona through Nico Toscani, a former intelligence operative turned Chicago cop investigating political corruption. While that film established many of Seagal's signature traits of a calm demeanor, the Aikido-based combat wit operated on a much bigger canvas of government conspiracy and international intrigue. Out for Justice feels considerably more intimate. Gino isn't fighting corrupt institutions, he's dealing with the murder of a lifelong friend, and the story plays out almost entirely on the streets where he grew up. That smaller scale gives it more emotional weight than Above the Law while keeping the same grounded approach to action. Hard to Kill, 1990, shares obvious thematic ground. Both films follow cops driven by personal tragedy seeking justice against dangerous enemies. But Hard to Kill follows a more classic revenge structure, with its hero surviving an assassination attempt and returning years later for payback. Out for Justice instead keeps its focus on immediate loss. Bobby's murder happens right at the start, forcing Gino to act while his grief is still raw, giving the story real urgency and momentum. Marked for Death, also 1990, offers another useful comparison. Like Out for Justice, it centers on a determined lawman protecting his community from dangerous criminals, but it leans into mysticism and international crime that push the story toward bigger, more exaggerated territory. Out for Justice stays noticeably more grounded. Richie Madano is scary because he's believable, with no supernatural powers or criminal empire behind him, just raw psychological instability. Many longtime fans consider Out for Justice the most balanced film of Seagal's early career, combining the investigative feel of Above the Law, the emotional stakes of Hard to Kill, and the intensity of Marked for Death, while avoiding some of the more exaggerated elements found in those films. The comparison with Under Siege, released the following year, is especially telling. That film became Seagal's biggest commercial hit and introduced him to an even wider audience, with a much bigger budget, elaborate set pieces, and a bigger premise: the hijacking of a U.S. battleship. Despite its massive popularity, plenty of longtime fans still prefer Out for Justice for its intimacy. Gino feels like an ordinary man defending his own block, while Casey Ryback in Under Siege gradually becomes something closer to a legendary action hero. Both approaches work, but they offer very different experiences. Out for Justice also invites comparison to other urban crime thrillers of the era, most obviously Cobra, starring Sylvester Stallone, another film centered on a determined lawman going up against violent criminals.